Come on over, Nathan. We did a workshop earlier today between 4:30 and 6:30 on microservices and event sourcing and making evented autonomous services in Ruby. Since Ben is not here, we're gonna try to fill in, but we don't really have a preset presentation that we can really pull off within a half an hour. So what I thought I'd do is take a little segment of that workshop, a slide deck, and present to you a misconception of microservices that is fairly common, not just in the Rails world, but pretty much in the world where web developers have heard the word microservices, leapt to a conclusion of what that is, and have often leapt to the death of their project. So, and then maybe we could just have an interactive whiteboard session about anything, really. It's also Nathan's birthday, as those of you who were here earlier. It pleases me to no end when I get a room full of people to sing him happy birthday, because I know that's just makes his knee do that.
I've already planned how I'm going to win.
Great. Yeah. So let's just do that. And some of y'all were not in the workshop this afternoon, right? How many people were not there? Not, wow, okay. So this is going to suck because there's going to be a lot of out of context information. How many people were there? Right. So all these people know exactly what we're talking about now, and I'll just have 20 minutes to drop a few bombs and hopefully it'll be some sort of cohesive knowledge. Right. So this is kind of how microservice projects tend to happen when you're starting with what has now been affectionately deemed the monolith, which is effectively what frameworks like Rails and Express and Phoenix tend to create. Teams with larger code bases tend to get to this point. Let's say you've got a Rails application and it's got a product model. And you have a lot of years of development on this thing, a lot of developers working on it. It's one code base. And we start to get the sense that if we could just take this large code base and separate it into smaller code bases, that things are going to get a lot easier for those teams. We could subdivide the large team into a bunch of smaller teams. We're not dealing with the same, committing to the same code base, all that kind of stuff. Is anybody actually dealing with a situation like that or has dealt with it just yet? Okay, so a few of y'all have, all right. We usually hear the word extract said in context of let's extract the X service. And I'm here to tell you that when you hear the word extract talking about a monolith, where the end goal is services or service architecture, that's usually a red flag. That usually indicates something that is not actually, that doesn't actually have a destination. That's a service architecture. So let me tell you what we're talking about here. This is just sort of this is my foil. This is the product model. Let's just say this is a product model in a Rails database, in a Rails application. And it's not meant to be complete or realistic, but hopefully it's familiar to you. If you had a thing called a product, maybe your e-commerce or something, that you have a model like this, and it would be an ID, of course, a name, a description. It's got a price, the quantity in stock because you're selling these things, and an image URL that has a picture of it that you display from whatever asset server you have. Does that look about right to y'all? Doesn't seem anything weird about that? Just want to make sure everyone's kind of, if you were going to dream something like this up, that it would kind of look like this in a Rails app. Right on. So what we do when we get into this, we need to extract the product service. We have to look at this as what this, we'll look at this product model as what it really is. We call it a model, but it's a database. It's a database table, right? We say it's a model, it's a database table. Goes from the database into the Rails app, we call it a model. In reality, it's a database table. We could call it a database table, but it's Rails, so we call it a model. By extracting this, we move it into its own app. This is the holy grail. We want to take this out because we want to get a little team going together. It's just working on the product stuff. We take that model out and all the code that's wrapped around it. We put it into its own application. Put an API around it. We'll call it REST, even though it's just HTTP and there is no hypermedia, but we'll still call it REST because that's what we've learned to call it since Rails 3. And then we just change the color of the box and call it a service. It's just an app, but we'll call it a service. And the problem with that is it's not a service. It's a web development view of what a service must be. How else could it be? What else could it be? And what else could it be about except something that is a concept in our application, like a model object, like a product, like a user. The other one is this. Let's extract the user service. Let's extract the auth service, right? And it's really a user object, user model. And the core principle in play here is that components or services are not about data. Product table is data. They're about behaviors. A service is a thing that you can do with or about something in your system. And we really have in this product model is different concerns that may become different services or different components. So I'm going to use the word component now rather than talking about service. And the reason for that is a service is nothing more than a loop or a host, some process running on your server or your box or whatever it is, some process running that has a component inside it. So the service is really just the machine level stuff, the network level stuff. I'm going to throw that word away. We're just going to talk about components because that really talks about what the code is. So we have these different components, let's say, and they're all about product. Some of it is inventory. Product ID, quantity, and stock is about inventory. And in pricing, we have, of course, well, it should actually say price, not cost. But we have this pricing component, and then we've got this catalog component that has this sort of descriptive stuff about it. So we didn't extract a product service, because a product is an entity. And services aren't about entities, because entities are about data. We separated behaviors and created units of these behaviors, units of functionality that have data that pertain to them. So we start with this version of a product, and what you would end up in your migration towards a service architecture is not a product service. You would end up with inventory service, pricing service, catalog service, and each one of those have data that they are authoritative over, they care about, and that they work with. And the important thing to realize here is it's not one product table. In fact, it was never one product table. Or in fact, it might never should have been one product table, even when it was in a Rails monolith. So you get bits of product, it's still product, but there's this perspective. It's the pricing perspective of product. It's the catalog perspective of product. It's the inventory perspective of product. And those things are called roles. So it's basically product in the role of pricing. It's just this. Product in the role of catalog. It's just that information. Product in the role of pricing. It's just that other information. The other word for that is context. What does product mean in the context of inventory? ID, quantity, and stock. What's product in the context of catalog? It's product ID and the descriptive information, and so on. So it's not this, it's this. We get to this other fundamental rule or principle that components, and you can, every time I'm saying component, you can also say service, they're authoritative over their data. So the only thing that's going to change or interact with or affect the data about pricing is the pricing service. So here's an inventory component. Like I said earlier, a service is just the computing infrastructure wrapped around a component and making it runnable. That's it. So what do you call this service? Since a service is just a host, a runtime host for components, this one has inventory and pricing. Why? Because a service is just a component host. You can put components in it. So what do you call that service? Yeah, that's sure.
Question mark, question mark, question mark.
Question mark, yeah. Could be a UUID, really. The thing is, it's not about, when you're working on service architectures, leaping to the conclusion of what your service names are is also a bit of a red flag. Leaping directly to it's the product service is sort of the ORM plus MVC preconception of what service architecture is. The hint here is you may not need to name your services yet. This is kind of a ridiculous, this is probably a ridiculous runtime design for the reason that inventory might be dealing with a certain amount of traffic, a certain volume of traffic, and this thing might be dealing with another certain volume of traffic, and the amount of resources they're competing for. Now they're competing with each other for resources, and you might not want to do that because they've got to deal with different volumes of traffic. So that's when you start to separate things. You're really looking at service as the infrastructural stuff that you decide, how much traffic or how much volume you've got to deal with to figure out what kind of computing resources you've got to face with. So this whole thing that you go through, you've got a Rails monolith, and we want to start extracting the product service, and let's extract the user service, and let's extract the auth service. That's not exactly a useful project. It's not exactly a useful use of your time and money. Because you will end up with not a service architecture, but a distributed monolith, which is worse than a monolith, because it has all the problems of the monolith, and now you have all the non-determinism of distributed systems. And the best thing to have done with that thing is to leave it alone and clean it up. A service architecture is not going to help you build the monolith that you wish you had, with the right code and the right decoupling and the right refactoring. The only thing that's going to solve that is writing the right code and putting the right modeling and the right refactoring and actually doing that work. Jumping to a service architecture is probably going to introduce failure scenarios that you've never even conceived of, that are all the result of the laws of distributed computing that if you are a Rails developer, a monolith developer, you've never even been exposed to, you've never even seen, you've never even thought of. And these things are going to come at you not necessarily with runtime failures, but corrupted data and bad transactions and inconsistent values. Monoliths aren't bad. Bad monoliths are bad. First clean them up, and then consider whether or not you're going to do a distributed system out of it. A fun thing, this is a monolith. We colloquially call the application built around this a monolith. That's shorthand for an application built with a monolithic architecture. You get monolithic architecture because you started with a monolithic database table. If you didn't start with a monolithic database table, you wouldn't have a monolithic application. You would have a Rails application that had 3 product tables where the right information about the right concern, pricing, inventory, catalog would be in separate tables. That would no longer be monolithic. Well, unless you connected the product table to the order line item table, to the order table, to the customer table, and then you're back to the monolith. Because leaping through associations by .dereferencing thing and implicitly running queries against things that are outside of the context, that also puts you right back into monolithic architecture. So, that's the counterintuitive stuff that I thought I'd drop out there and see if we could have a little bit of a discussion. Oh, it's 7:30. I guess we're done.
No, you got plenty of time, man.
Very good. Oh, cool. So we didn't really like prepare we don't want to go into our long workshop because it would take a long time. But maybe we could just like kick around some ideas and whiteboard some stuff or have a conversation. Shoot. You're not going to like it.
I think, I'll just start. I think the number one most important thing to start doing differently is to identify. So if you say that you have a bad monolith, then I think that you can infer that you made some mistakes to get there. And the most important thing to do, which is not exactly fun, is to identify those mistakes and stop making them in the future. Because you have ongoing product development, it's a reality. And as long as the vector for what makes it a bad monolith today has not been stopped, it's going to get worse faster. It's always going to get worse faster than you can make it better, unless the mistakes stop. So I think, Scott mentioned dot dereferencing. When you're jumping around across, taking these elaborate long journeys across associations and pulling data from all over the place, that's creating that kind of coupling that's going to make the work harder. And a lot of monoliths can't get out of the deficit that they're in faster than they can. It's like trying to fill a ditch, trying to fill a hole, but there's new, the hole's being dug at the same time. Bad analogy. Just erase the last 10 seconds.
Maybe something with a hurricane.
Yeah. So that's the first part of that. But there's more.
If you want to talk about just the coding patterns, which I say you're probably not going to like it. It's right. I assert that what I'll show you is right. If you're a Rails developer and you've been inculcated in this world, this stuff will start to sound, well, I mean, distributed services is going to just blow your mind, first of all. But if the intermediary stage between like a good Rails app, well, first of all, you can't go from a Rails app to distributed services easily unless you've already structured your Rails app around non-monolithic rows. So first of all, you've kind of got to understand what the context and what the set right services would be in the future, and then model your database like that. So first thing you need to do is break those associations. So what you realize is you've got these vertical partitions in your app. Maybe it's user and product and order. And under order, there's like order lines. Have you ever done this? User dot orders.
Dot last.
That stuff that code has to be removed. Because these things are separate contexts. They're separate partitions. They should not be able to simply query each other just by going dot something. It's great that Rails and Active Record and before that Hibernate and before that Top Link, that all these tools, ORMs, have this. But they will guarantee that you'll never get out of the monolith. Now maybe you don't want to get out of the monolith. But a good way to keep your code clean is to not just treat dot dereferencing objects as a way to hide queries. So every time you go across one of these context lines, you would create a explicit query object. So I would create a, let's say in lib.
So let's say we're getting the user's most recent order.
Why not make it even more complicated? How about we just get an order?
Okay, but there's going to be many.
Fair enough. Okay. So under lib, I put another folder, maybe call it application, You can't call it app because Rails has burned that namespace. And under that, I might put a namespace. I'm saying these are directories. I'm gonna start calling them namespace because it's a namespace. Every directory is a namespace. File system namespace. In Ruby, you have modules and classes. Those are namespaces. So we're looking at namespacing. We're looking at taking these partitions and putting them into our code. Maybe it's order or orders. Under that, optionally, two things. Oh, maybe a directory called queries. Sometimes I'm saying this is, don't go and like just take my word for it. But usually this is what you have. Queries and something called commands. But if all the classes and all the files in those two directories are named the same, then maybe you put them in just in this order directory. So I'm just going to presume, just for the sake of argument, that we've got an order directory, order namespace. By the way, this now in Ruby corresponds to application : order
The constant lookup tab.
quarter : let's just call it by user. If I want to be real specific about it, maybe it's by user ID. Sorry, the hell am I doing? By underscore user underscore ID dot RB. And that query, you write an object. You write a class. And the class represents the query. Sure, it could use active record underneath. It could actually say, the code in here could just say, what am I getting? Order by user ID. How do you do that in active record? Order dot find by user ID or order dot find by, and it might just call that. It might just call that code. But all the other code in your system, that wants to do that query uses that class. It doesn't just snatch active record constants and bind to them and just dot this, dot that, dot that, dot that. So every single query, and this is why you're not going to like it. I love it because it leaves my Rails code bases super understandable, super maintainable, and gives me a way forward. Everything I can do to query data from my Rails application gets a query class, a query object. Those query objects are the only thing that use the active record retrieval or active record query interface.
Finder. I think it's called the Finder API. Is what they call it.
They who? These people? Those people?
No, I think it Rails calls it the Finder. I could be wrong. All those names scopes .where, .order, .everything. That's that class API for building select.
Would you consider an application to be a little bit generic with context here, right?
Yeah.
When you're thinking about the benefits that you get from the separation, I feel like the ability to talk about an order in a different context is things that you get, right? Because maybe like order means something different to someone who's dealing with actions.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I feel like
But I'm presuming here that you've got a models folder, and in that models folder you've got a class. Here's the worst thing that Rails does. It burns the global namespace. So you've probably got it.
Gives the benefits of that, right? It basically just takes the Rails organization pattern and then throws it in different modules rather than you know, like I don't see like the benefits of that.
Well, if you had
Wait,
different
hold on.
perspectives of order,
Right.
you can have different namespaces underneath the application.
Yeah. And what are you asserting as an object-oriented style?
What do you mean?
Well, you just said do it instead of doing it, like this way. Just do it in. Why is that object-oriented? That's not object-oriented, by the way. So I'm coming after you a little bit. It's going to be fun. You stuck your head out. Now I'm going to go after it. That is actually not object-oriented. That's object relational mapping using objects, but it's not object-oriented. And that's the fundamental challenge with Rails. It's because if you've come up through Rails and you call that OO, you're never going to get to OO.
I guess my comparison would be more towards this approach where you say order by user ID, I assume that you're going to have a .call method, right? Which is more of a functional Ruby style, which
What makes it more functional?
Well, because typically you will not have state that is being mutated.
But objects encapsulate state, so it's invisible to the outside world anyway. So they don't really differ that much, right?
What do you mean?
If objects encapsulate state, then that state is not resident outside the world of the object. Therefore, an interface that just exposes call is just as suitable a candidate to be object-oriented programming as it is to be functional.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at that point, it's semantics, right? I'm just saying, like,
It is.
it's a traditional, like, Ruby Rails approach. You
Yeah.
have orders.
Well, I don't,
versus-
yeah, I don't doubt that this is very different than
But
that.
my original question was just, like, the context portion of it. I feel like that benefit, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I feel like that there's an extra step in there to get that, rather than just restructuring it simply to the
Well, this-
service command pattern.
So at this point, we're beyond convention. There's no more conventions at this point.
No, yeah.
And if you have various contexts, we tend to use modules to distinguish context. So you might get deeper and deeper into different namespaces. And namespaces are your means of allowing different class implementations to go in different places that are segregated or bounded. But we're not really showing that here in this example. But you can do anything you want in a live application. It's very different than app models or app controllers.
Yeah, I think like the main point here is that user grade. That you don't need a user to get the orders. You just need the ID of that one.
Oh, but there's two ways. Yeah, no, you're right. So it's interesting. There's and based on that groan, at some point you will have to retrieve the user. But you're right. You only need the user ID. That's a really important thing. Because if you pass a user into the .call method on that class, well, now that class knows about that user. And then the first line of code, it's going to be like user ID equals user.id. So if a method uses user ID, don't pass user. You just increase the coupling, and you've just reduced your ability to make changes. Don't pass an object when all you need is a value. But you might create another. God, I wish we had now I want to code this one up. I want to code this. But if we did this implementation where I feel like a mad scientist. Yeah, get out of it. Thank you. So let's say we had this class called by user ID.
And it would be in a namespace.
Right. So this is in the order namespace. So if you saw the code order : order : queries : by user ID, you should be able to figure out from that name what that does. But the call method would take user ID, right? All right.
I hate to throw the S word, but you have to have a security context. Otherwise, you're likely to let an adversary call any order by abusing your application.
Welcome to Rails. I don't know how. What? Yeah. Welcome, but security belongs security belongs as much as possible. Protections belong at the gate. You can do defense in depth, and that's reasonable, but only when you have to, and only when it's required. But I would not volunteer for defense in depth. I would only do it because it's really costly to do. But if that's
they're not going to make sense of it anyway.
if that's the case, I would pass in extra stuff. But that would be a less desirable design for me. This is core logic. This is kernel logic. This is logic that ideally operates without considerations. Like the security stuff has happened, and here's just the guts. So we can't pass the security context into every single method. Well, .NET tried that, and it didn't really go very well. So back to this point of design. Ceph.call user ID. Here's the other thing you do on this. can do on this. Because we got this tension. We want the primitive value, user ID. That's what the class should operate on. That's what the class should operate on. And even though, let me change this here by user ID. So I'll give myself a little bit of space. What I'd really, ideally, truly, really want to see, me personally, is def initialize user ID. And let's pretend this is Ruby future, and you just set the instance variable, and it sets it automatically, because some future version of Ruby is supposed to do that. And you don't do this, you just do def.call. But you can provide what we would think of as a convenience method, def self.call, and take a user. Right? So, what? No user. If you've got a user, just use a user. Because the controller has current user. So if you want to do this, then you don't want to strip the value off, and you want, and I'm not saying do this, I'm saying here's how you would do it. You would put a class method on here that is for convenience. The instance interface it represents the purest primitive form. The class interface represents convenience, and you'd say instance equals new user.id, and then instance dot call, and you get both. You get the primitive interface, because the object interface should be primitive. By the way, there's a fundamental rule, another fundamental rule that is often broken. Rule. Nothing's really a rule. This is like the 99.59's guideline. An initializer should do one thing and one thing only. Receive inputs and record them as field values. Any other computation should be out. So if you're doing anything in initializer, then other than saying at user ID equals user ID, you have something to reconsider. These are not for logic. If you need to do extra logic, destructuring an object, pulling values off of it, put some other factory method on the class. Right? And then do a bunch of stuff to strip out values here and then pass them into these constructors. By the time you get to the initializer, you should be dealing with primitive values. By the time you get to the instance interface, you should be dealing with primitive values. So you could call this either with primitive values if you've got them, or if you happen to be in a controller, and the most common thing you have is a user object, because you're using like devise, you go like controller.currentUser, and that's what you have. You can maybe do that if you want to do it. I'm not really sure if that's the right thing to do in this case, because you also get coupling here, you get connaissance, but it's not entirely the worst kind, because you're in a kind of monolithic space anyway. Go ahead.
So say a new requirement comes in, and we don't really care about just the user right thing. We care about finding the orders where the user's also active as well, right? What would the approach be?
Find all orders with an active user?
Yes. Basically, there's some other parameters, right? And this query no longer makes sense in that context. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Create a new class, new query.
this whole thing.
Well, as long as nothing else is coupled to it, you can delete it. But create a new class. And I'm sorry, I'm stepping on. The amazing thing is when you have I deleted what the folder structure looks like. When you have this, you can look at that folder structure and say, this is all of the data access that my application does. And you can just look at the file system and start to get an idea. A new developer on the team can get an idea. Somebody auditing can get an idea. You can see this is the kinds of ways that we access this database. When it's just that this, that, find, blah, 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 you have that's why Rails applications get crappy. That's why developers lose the passion and the joy, because you lose the ability to understand what's happening, because data access is just everywhere. You can do data access while rendering a view template. You don't really know, and then you look at the testing, And then you look at the testing, it's like, why are we setting up all this data? It's like, well, I can't find the data access. Oh, the data access will be done in the view template. Like, that's basically, that's not, these aren't questions of architecture, by the way.
I worked with a Rails app a couple of years ago where there was a model called S3 object. And when you initialize it, there was an active record after initialize hook that would query S3 to see if the object was there and fill out some internal values. And so when you were in testing, for instance, you would try to call new.new or whatever, and if you were on an airplane and you didn't have internet, your test would fail.
Yeah. You should be able to initialize an object simply, just with primitive values, and exercise it. And the word exercise, I'm using that in the more general word for testing. You should be able to exercise an object directly, and you shouldn't have to fuss with a whole bunch of things. I shouldn't be required to instantiate a user class in order to test a query that only needs a user ID. So my test logic just needs a variable, not a class, a variable. Use the most direct coupling you can to test things. Otherwise, your tests are going to start to become as incomprehensible as that code. And that's when productivity starts to tank. These are just rules of coupling. These are just the principles of coupling. And if you ignore them, if you don't know them, you won't even think that that's a problem. Especially in the Rails community, because everybody's writing blog posts that say things like fat model, skinny controller, which is a violation of the fundamental principles of coupling and design. If you don't know that, you'll follow that because that's what the community is doing.
Yeah.
And that's.
Well, I think you're citing a lot of things as problems that sound a lot more like you're not using Rails the way it was intended to be used, which is your prerogative. But I don't think you can blame people calling the database from the views on Rails because you're not supposed to do that. So if someone's doing that, I mean, they don't want to do that. But you use Rails the way it's meant to be used, or don't use it, that's fine. But you're citing a lot of problems with Rails and are not a problem with Rails.
Sure. Okay. So.
And it is a lot. I've worked in a system that had microservices architecture for 2 years that had 23 apps because their rules like we're gonna make every new thing its own service.
Yes.
And they were like, oh, well, we're gonna give it to Sinatra because it doesn't need Rails. We just need one file. It's fine.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, it's a big ass app that should have been a Rails app because.
Yeah. But that's not a service, and that's not a microservices architecture. It's not.
According to you.
No, according to the rules of service-oriented architecture.
Yeah. Whose rules? You haven't cited any sources for anyone yet. So, I
Four
don't know what your sources are.
four tenets of service-oriented architecture. The most basic rules of service-oriented architecture. If anybody, and that's why I started off earlier and said, there's a concept of service-oriented architecture, which microservices is, that has evolved in the web developer world, that evolved by not looking into what service architecture is, and presuming that it's web apps, that are just many, many web apps. And I know exactly what you're talking about. That's a nightmare scenario. And that scenario will cause anybody, and has caused anybody. In fact, DHH gave a keynote a few years ago that said that, and he brought somebody on stage, actually the conference, somebody came on stage, like, this is not a good thing, just love the monolith. The monolith is majestic. Because people tried to do microservices project without getting a firm understanding of service architecture and made many, many apps that connect to each other via synchronous HTTP. And that's a distributed monolith. And it's horrifying. And man, yeah, if this was like a revival tent, I'd want to heal you, because that's a horrifying experience. But it's not service architecture. Because if you had service architecture, you would have had something like PubSub and messaging. And you could have taken down any one of those apps, you could have taken them offline, and the rest of the whole thing would have continued working.
You can still use PubSub in a Rails app.
Yeah.
I think the problem is Rails.
Well, so
No, it's not. I mean, you can actually use Rails intelligently. It's just that there are cultural mores, there are cultural currents in the Rails community, because it's a web development community, that have sort of shut the door on the learning from the outside of service architecture getting in. And people are building these things called services, and they're building apps. If you put a get, and we talk about this, if you put an interface, if you put a method on a service that allows you to query data out of it, it's not a service. If you can go to a service and get data and bring it back and operate on it, it's not a service. It's no longer autonomous. It's a distributed monolith. That fundamental rule, when that's understood, will completely change the way the architecture is done. And it won't matter if you use Sinatra or Rails or Phoenix or anything, because that stuff just doesn't matter to service architecture.
I won't say enjoy, but I'm happy to use Rails as a web framework. It gets the latest security patches. It's very well tried and true. Pretty much any problem related to what it does is going to be a lot of answered questions on Stack Overflow. I use it more as a web framework than an application framework. But I think that, I've worked with a lot of Rails apps over the years, and I definitely see the same patterns over and over again. And I think at some point, it's really like not, in my view, it's not so much of a blame game saying this technology sucks, this is good, this is bad. It's about understanding how to characterize our systems, what kinds of qualities we'd like to get out of it, what kinds of decisions we make lead to qualities that are desirable and undesirable, and using analysis to drive our decisions. It's my 2 cents.
But I want to kind of return to something you said, that it's not like Rails. It's not, the things that I said are not really the Rails way, and I think that was a solid point. But here's something that is the Rails way. Fat model skinny controller is the Rails way. Now it's been corrected, but it was the way for years. Model associations between model partitions without recognizing model partitions and breaching partitions, that is the Rails way. And those things fundamentally make Rails projects get harder and harder to work with. Your ability to make progress will continue to decline when we do that. And that can be described just with coupling. You can actually describe that just by running it through static analysis tools and basically showing, like, here's where afference is, here's where reference is, here's abstractness versus concreteness, here's the hotspots in your app. These are the things that need to be fixed, or else you're going to have, progress decline. So that stuff is that kind of stuff is well known. But, and I don't mean, I'm sorry, I'm walking over, but I don't mean to be like, snarky and bitchy about this, but I bet.
Sometimes you just gotta be snarky and bitchy.
Because this is a shitty thing to do. I hate when I watch presenters do this. But I'll do this, and it's one of the things that, how many of you can define afference? Let me put it this way. Afference is a design quality that you can almost run through a function and predict the decline of productivity on your team. And it's easily obtainable from a static analysis tool. We don't care about that in the Rails community because we are still saying, look how fast I can hack something together. But that's only important for the first 2 months of your project. No, you can go much longer than 2 months. But I think of that as software creationalism. It's very easy to create software. It's very difficult to raise it. You're going to be raising your software a lot longer than you're going to be creating. Microsoft had this project. Rapid application development in Microsoft, in .NET and Visual Basic was this problem. It was very easy to create software, very difficult to own it. The cost is after creation. Anybody can get creation to happen. That's not the hard part. We don't need tools to create software. That's the easy part. That's the cheapest part, aside from actually understanding customer fit and problem solution fit. That's a business and that's a product design problem. But the whole product development cycle, the cost isn't up front. It's ongoing. And so all of our efforts should be around making that cost go away. And that's the things that after you do this for 25 years, you start saying, man, it's the same damn problems every damn time. This is supposed to be so much easier. We're supposed to be moving so much faster. I'm not deviating from Rails. Actually, no, not at all. Not at all. No. And I can only do that by assertion. But I want to return on something you said. It's not an alternative to Rails. That's a misconception.
It's an ideological work. You're proposing microservices as a solution that problem monolith. You're just picking different monoliths.
No, we're not creating a different monolith. We're not creating a different monolith because we're not building a bunch of applications. We're not creating a distributed monolith. We're creating distributed services.
I just don't know what Rails app lets you with like a large scale like strong Rails app that hasn't had like separate like an internal services culture. There's all little services that are happening.
I have.
That I've worked in.
Right, but that has only existed for 3 years.
Okay.
So unless you've only been here for 3 years.
Are you judging me for only being here for 3
No, I'm not judging. I'm just saying Rails is, we're into year 10 of production Rails. Services came around 3 years ago by someone digging up something from .NET that was supposed to be buried, not because it was treasure, but because it was garbage, and dug up the services thing from DDD literalism from 2006 and said, hey, here's something that I found. It's like, oh no, don't do that. We debunked that. We don't do that anymore. And smack dab, look, now we got services. And then along comes Uncle Bob and says, hey, services. Well, I can put a gem on that and call it interactors. And they'll use it. But it wasn't a good idea. He just took the garbage from one place and put it into another place. There's still none of the fundamental things that need to be there. Partitioning. That's it. It's partitioning, partitioning, partitioning. And when you take partitioning in your model and you stop putting associations through partitions, if you take that to a larger scale or a better scale or the next step, you're going to get these other things called partitions. Another word for that is bounded context. Another word for bounded context is service. All of these things march forward on a path of elaboration elaboration, sophistication. But you don't need to do services. It's just that when you work with services, it's fascinating how much easier the work gets. It's astonishing how easy it is to build services. The logic is so compact and direct and directed, but it requires a little bit more. You know, it's another level of software development.
But it requires a whole different type of software problem to have, right?
Not at all.
But how many people does it take to maintain a set of services?
We had, the last place I was at, we had 3 people and 5 services. It was not a big deal.
I know, like, this is different.
Are you okay? But hold on. But it's okay, right? Like.
I'm just thinking, because I don't do the Ruby meetup often. I kind of came here because I've already kind of.
We're gonna delete this tape too, by the way, right?
It's still rolling.
It sounds like an online kind of discussion, and that's not why I came to a real place to do that. I came because I'm already kind of have a bias
Yeah.
for this problem. And so I would like, if possible, if you guys don't mind, for him to continue addressing the back on. I feel like I've seen that a lot.
I'm perfectly happy to do that if we both agree. And by the way, I want to say, I'm sorry, what's your name? What is it? Brittany. This is my favorite. Like, this back and forth couldn't happen if we weren't willing to have a meaningful conflict and to hold it without becoming petty and like really like defending our position in a humane and civil way. I love it's so good. Yeah, it's so good. So as long as both Brittany and I agree that this meaningful negotiation of meaning, even though conflictual, can be ended so that we can move on, I'm fine with doing it. But I don't think anybody else should be willing to end it.
I have one final caveat. You mentioned something that we should optimize software for the long term in a sense rather than the initial creation stage. I think in many cases that may be true, but there are still plenty of use cases where the business needs make it so you would optimize the initial creation.
So there's a no. It's not. It's not. I'm just saying that you've got to do both. You've got to have a software methodology that allows you to exploit the short term and take care of the long term. And if you're not explicitly doing that, then you're basically going to take short-term tools and you're going to try to you take oversimplifications and you're going to try to run them out over a time period where they start becoming more harmful than helpful.
That's future Ruby's problem.
Yeah, and you can always leave the company, right? Like, you can leave that for somebody else.
You know, I've left Rails shops because the code got too bad and I didn't want to deal with it anymore.
Yeah, you know.
Anybody here done that? Like, that's it.
I'm actually at the other. I have the code base that's been around since 2010. I've seen all the communities.
Yeah.
Developers? Yeah.
Like it takes, I'm interested of my other program today. I spent more time. I wrote one line of code, but I spoke this one in the background.
Oh yeah. When you're writing code on messaging services, it's easy. Here's the thing. Developers don't quit jobs. They quit either managers or code bases. And when your developers are quitting you because of the code base, that's kind of tragic. But that's normal.
Yeah, there are, like, if you're reading it, you see that there's two books that are listed for this, Clean Code and Drawing Code by Test.
But that's
There's an amazing book that talks about architecture, the way that the framework for the developer, and I will Clean Code and
It's clean code the other way.
yeah. It's a good book.
I would bite my tongue.
Is there any good open source projects on GitHub that would have a good example of this microservices architecture?
Well, we have examples of it in our example repos. Eventide prod. What is it? And I know, and it's like, oh, look, self-congratulatory. Well, we do that. We planted him earlier, paid him accordingly. But it's tough. People like service architecture stuff. It doesn't usually just get put into the public domain as open source. There's a reason for that, and it's going to sound snobbish. When you start building service-oriented systems, you end up with a skill ladder in your organization where not every developer can work immediately on service components. So you actually end up with a more proper leveling of human beings to the problems. And you might have more junior people working on more junior things and more senior people working on the things that require a little bit of sense of distributed systems. And that's not to say you should have elitism. You absolutely should not. You should destroy that. We should be destroying that in organizations at every time we get. But what you do have is a career path that now goes way further than when it went when we're just working on Monolith. So it's a really exciting thing to transform your organization into service-oriented architecture stuff, because you still have the web stuff to work on, which I think of as more basic skilling. But you have this upper echelon, and you then build the long-term and short-term maintenance cycles that also include mentoring and coaching and bringing people up and identifying and building apprenticeship programs. It's really hard to build an apprenticeship program around a monolithic code base, because it's like, what happens? Like, oh, here's the new technique. The new hotness is service objects, and now that's going to be what the seniors talk about. It's like, it's more moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. It's not really solving the fundamental problem, which is there's an absence of partitioning in the model, and there's an absence of recognition of what afference does to productivity.
Yeah, this is a little bit self-indulgent, but I'm going to do it anyway. We worked closely with a graduate of one of the code academies in Austin, and she's very bright on her own. She's going to pick everything up quickly. But we were coaching her, and she was doing distributed systems work. Within, I don't know what the calendar time was, maybe 12 months, but
It's a lot sooner than that.
maybe 6 to 12 months. She had item potence, concurrency, all these quote unquote advanced topics backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
That progression is actually exciting, and it's very liberating, because you know what you don't know at first. You know you don't know a whole lot, and you're given a path to become capable of designing much bigger systems than you started with.
And senior developers who are willing to teach rather than lord it over you.
Yes.
So it requires it does also require, architecture and culture are inseparable. You can't just do one without the other. Boy, that went downhill.
I got another question.
We can't erase that tape. We can't erase that tape though, right? Yeah. Are we ever going to be allowed to come back? Yeah, no, I'm okay with that. I think that's honest.
A hard no is better than a soft no.
So I guess we're going to wrap it up. I was going to say that Nathan and I, and I said this on the meetup page, it's a pretty huge cliche, the whole geek beer thing. We actually really like beer. We're really excited about going to the Atlantis Porter Bar. We've heard it's a good beer place to go. If anybody else wants to go out and continue talking, we don't actually know how to get to the Porter Bar, so that'd be a good plus. Otherwise, thank you, Brittany. First of all, thank you for engaging in this kind of dialogue. Right on. And thank y'all, thank the rest of you for pushing back and actually like arguing. This is a topic that needs argument. It can't just be shoved in. I'm glad to see that there's pushback and that we can debate this, because I think it needs to be debated rather than sort of stuffed under the rug with cute nomenclature like majestic monolith. That avoids conversation, and this conversation is a difficult conversation. So thank y'all.
Yep. Anything else you chat afterwards, do it.
This video has been sponsored by Rieta Incorporated. Learn more today at RIE.